Terrific. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm John Handa. I'm the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow at GINSA. I worked in government for close to 15 years, and with regard to the Middle East, there was never any shortage of disastrous scenarios that, could cross your mind in the middle of the night, things that, if they actually ever came to pass, would really spoil the US government's day. But while all these scenarios that you could conjure were bad, it always seemed to me that there was a much smaller subset of events that would not only be truly awful if they transpired, but that were really in the ballpark of plausibility or enough plausibility that they were worthwhile to actively be thinking through and devoting some amount of attention and resources to trying to prevent. That doesn't mean, again, that any of these scenarios were likely to happen, just that they carried a slightly higher possibility of transpiring in the near term than your average nightmare scenario, and therefore were probably worth paying some extra attention to. Chaos in a nuclear Pakistan was always one of those worth putting near the top of the list. So too was, the economic collapse of Egypt leading to massive political turmoil. And a third was the potential for instability in Jordan, which is our topic today. Was always also a perennial worry that would kind of keep you up at night. Jordan hasn't gotten a huge amount of attention since October the 7th in Washington. And that's, perfectly understandable given all the other issues and things that are happening, but also probably a little bit short-sighted with the war in Gaza still raging and the possibility for a much larger war in Lebanon on the horizon. Just think for a minute of how much worse things could instantly get if suddenly the stability and pro-American orientation of Jordan's regime were suddenly thrown into question and Israel's Eastern Front was suddenly somehow on fire. And there's been plenty happening in Jordan, actually, since October 7th that should at least give people some cause for concern and cause for paying some additional attention. That's why GINSA thought it was important to do this webinar today devoted to Jordan and the challenges and risks that it's currently facing. And I'd say we're not alone in that. Our president and CEO at GINSA, Mike McCoskey, was just in Israel last week, leading what is our flagship program of recently retired U.S. generals and admirals to Israel, where they had a number of very important meetings with the senior command of the IDF, the intelligence community, as well as the people in Israel's government, including the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who highlighted actually during the course of their meeting the danger of some of Iran's intensifying efforts to destabilize and even take over Jordan eventually. And I can also relay the conversation that GINSA had in an important meeting with an senior Arab official. I think it was in May or in April, who was really deeply worried about the intensifying what they described as pro-Hamas protests in the kingdom, so much so that they suggested that some of Jordan's neighbors had actually started developing some contingency plans to actually extract the Jordanian royal family to safety should the worst black swan event happen in Jordan. So to help us sort through some of what the real risks are that Jordan is facing today, and maybe to calm us down, but also what should be done to try and mitigate those risks, I'm glad to welcome a great group of experts. Gaithel Amari is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. in what now probably seems like a lifetime ago to him, and in a galaxy far, far away. He previously served as an advisor to the Palestinian Authority negotiating team during the 1999 to 2001 Israeli-Palestinian talks on reaching a permanent solution to the conflict. Marissa Kerma is the program director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. She's actually coming to us from Belgrade today, Yugoslavia, or in Serbia, forgive me. She previously worked from 2003 to 2010 as the director of the Information Bureau at the Embassy of Jordan in Washington, D.C. Finally, although he's not on with us yet, we're still hoping that we're going to be joined by my colleague, retired Major General Yaakov Amidror. Amidror is a distinguished fellow in Jintz's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. And after a 36-year career in the Israel Defense Forces, he subsequently served as the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So welcome to all. Before we start, let me just let the audience know that if you have any questions during the course of our conversation for our panelists, please submit them using Zoom's Q&A function, and I'll try and address as many of them as I can get to during the course of the conversation. Gaith, let me start with you and ask if you could just take a few minutes to provide people with kind of a broad brush scene setter to describe Jordan in the wake of October 7th, some of the dilemmas, the pressure it faces in the wake of Hamas's attack and in the ongoing war in Gaza, and how it's tried to grapple with some of those pressures and respond.
All right, thank you very much, John, and thank you for highlighting my career in failure, the peace process. But hey, you were a partner.
Yeah, we all share some part in it, Gaith. Exactly. You're not alone.
So as I was saying, everything that Amidror will say is wrong. So no, it's really great to see Yaakov and to be with everyone. Look, I mean, with Jordan, the perennial challenge when you're analyzing Jordan is how to find the right balance between alarmism and complacency. Jordan definitely has some serious challenges. Today, after October 7th, as you said, Iran has been targeting Jordan. This is not new. This has been going on for years, but really intensified after October 7th. The Muslim Brotherhood feels very emboldened and very linked with Hamas, and they're amplifying their messages. This comes on top of a major economic downturn, COVID, etc., and this only amplifies it. So, I mean, these are serious challenges that cannot be dismissed. These are real. Yet at the same time, I think to be overly alarmist is also unhealthy. I mean, Jordan has been a country on the verge of collapse since 1921, yet it has managed to do well. Everyone has prematurely forecasted its demise, yet it's probably the only functioning country right now in the Levant. So it has its own sources of resiliency and its own ways of dealing with these challenges. You know, Jordan is facing some obvious challenges. As we said, the Iranians directly through their proxies, through their allies in Syria and elsewhere, trying to flood Jordan with weapons and drugs, trying to create a public environment that is very unstable. The Jordanian establishment is also split in terms of how to deal at least with the domestic challenges. Some are advocating, and this is what we've seen so far, you know, the traditional Jordanian way of let people go to the streets, let them vent, but others are worried, especially in the military and security establishment. None of this is surprising. What is, though, 2 points I want to highlight before I end, is that what's really causing me some more concern right now is not these predictable challenges, but 2 or 3 unpredictable red flags. I don't want to say challenges yet. One is the Jordan-Israel relations. Jordan has always had a strategic relationship with Israel, despite all of the ups and downs. This continues. We saw it in November. I'm sorry, in April. Jordanian and Israeli military and intel are on daily contact. Yet the relations between the palace and the prime minister's office have been very tense for a while, and there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of how this goes on. The second challenge is the United States. We don't know what the election is going to bring in a few months' time. Last time President Trump was in office, the relations between Jordan and the U.S., while on the functional level, remained very strong, and the political level, where I don't want to say deep freeze, but certainly we're not as warm as you expect them. And there is no clarity in Jordan, and there's concern about what a second Trump administration would look like. And finally, in the region is changing. Some of Jordan's traditional allies and backers in the Gulf, et cetera, are basically changing their way. They're conducting policy and assistance policy in the region. Saudi, in particular, is inward looking. They moved away from a traditional model of assistance to a different model. And the relations, again, between the top leaders, while not in crisis, are certainly best described as tepid. So these are the kind of issues that worry me. Nothing we can do really. The Iranians will do what they will do. Hamas will do what they will do. But I think there's a lot that we can and we should focus on in strengthening Jordan's relation with its three key allies, the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
Good, terrific, Gaith. I hope to get to some of those ideas on specifically what we might do to bolster and strengthen those relationships in the kingdom. Marissa, let me turn to you. I want you to, comment on what you heard from Gaith, make any additions that you think are necessary. You've probably got more experience understanding what's happening in Jordan directly by being there than the rest of us. I would just say one thing that I hope to get to is I was struck early on, about a month after the war. I read an interview that Mary Louise Kelly from NPR had done in a very upscale cafe in Jordan. She did with 4 Jordanian women, all with kind of very good English, obviously very smart, very well educated, but just some of the statements a month after the Hamas slaughter in Israel. Israel had, just recently entered the ground war into Gaza. But just the level of venom, the willingness to openly claim they're pro-Hamas, that what had happened on October the 7th was something that was going to lead somehow to the liberation of Arabs and the Middle East was just very, very striking. And I think watching some of these protests in Jordan outside the Israeli embassy over the last eight months only, continued to underscore that the Jordanian population is obviously in a very, very different place than the regime. That's no surprise. As Gates said, that's been the case for a long time, given Jordan's demographics and the majority Palestinian population. But for a country that we in Washington always think of as incredibly pro-Western, pro-peace, strong relationship with Israel, the United States, the West, it does kind of take a Western observer aback a bit. So I wonder if you can weave some and help us understand some of that in your comments.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, John, and thanks to Ghaith as well for kicking us off. As Ghaith mentioned, there are a plethora of challenges that Jordan face, and I think that the October 7th attacks were unfortunately not too surprising for many Jordanians. I think the element of surprise of how it was conducted was, of course, something that most people understood, but why it happened for those Jordanians, particularly Jordanians of Palestinian origins or Palestinians who are still registered as Palestinian refugees in Jordan with UNRWA, they wake up in the morning and they have news from their family and friends, either in the West Bank or in Gaza. Or they read it in the local news, or they see it on some of the pan-Arab news stations. And there's always a story that hits home for them, where a family member was either arrested, or settlers had attacked a home, or some land grabbing was taking place. So those are the stories that are happening on a regular basis. And I think what made it really intense was the rise of the right-wing government in Israel, and some of the statements that many Jordanians felt threatened by when they heard it from some of the right-wing ministers. Last year, I think it was Minister Smotrich who had, I think, used a map of Israel that included Jordan in one of the conferences, and that really ruffled a lot of feathers, of course, in the government. And I think the Israeli ambassador was, summoned to the foreign ministry at the time. And I think now, with what is happening in Gaza, and it's not just sort of, oh, this is Al Jazeera or this is Al Arabiya, just portraying the death and destruction. It's, people who have lost family and friends. I have classmates that I went to high school with who lost like 17 members of their families in one bombing. And I think so it hits very deeply for a lot of people. So they're watching what's happening in Gaza, and they're also very much attuned to what's happening on the West Bank, which is also a story that is not being covered as extensively, in Western media and in the United States. But it's primarily one that is led by, right-wing settler violence against Palestinians, and a surge in arrests of Palestinians. Many of them are youth and children and women. And so that's what people are watching, and they hear the statements from the right-wing ministers, and they remember some of the earlier, alternative plans for Jordan being the alternative homeland for the Palestinians, or the so-called Jordan option being resurrected. So it becomes very real for a lot of people, not only Jordanians of Palestinian origin, which, by the way, I think right now it's very difficult to even make these distinctions, because there have been so many, intermarriages amongst families across Jordan. But if you were to, go back to this binary sort of designation, even the East Bankers feel the same way. They are more alarmed about what they are hearing from a lot of the right-wing ministers, especially, when we've heard statements at various right-wing conferences about the taking over in Gaza and the transfer of Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan, which is why we've also seen a more, I would say, a stronger tone from the government. The king has been very measured and balanced. The peace treaty, of course, remains intact, and the security cooperation as well. Jordan will not be able to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza if there were no channels of communication with Israel. So this is seen as crucial, and I think most people understand that. But this war in Gaza is not seen or felt through the Iran prism for the vast majority of Jordanians. They may understand that there is an Iran factor, but to them, this is the most existential component, and it's all about the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. And so that helps explain why we're seeing so many protests, and why we've seen this, I would say, a resurgence of pro-Hamas sentiments. And maybe there's an important distinction, and I don't know, Ghaith, if you agree with me here, but I think it's less about the movement and what it stands for, and more about armed resistance as the only means to end the Israeli occupation. Because, Hamas is an Islamist movement. I think it's like, political Islam or Islamism in Jordan have gone through, different waves and different challenges, and the relationship with the government and with officialdom also ebbs and flows depending on the crisis du jour. But I think right now there is worry, I think, about radicalization, and I am not at all surprised that this is what you heard on NPR, because I've heard the same sentiment not only from Muslims, but from Christians. I've heard from some of my Christian friends in Jordan who attend Mass every Sunday, who said that there were, elderly women and younger women praying for Hamas to win, because in their minds, this is the only means to Palestinian self-determination. And so, when we talk about the end of this war, there are so many implications that we have to work with and better understand as things wind down, hopefully in the near future, because it is, Hamas now represents an ideology. It's not just an Islamist resistance movement. And the last thing I would end with there is how the younger generation, I guess Gen Z, and those who are even younger, who are able, who are literate, who, always understood that Israel is a neighboring country, that there's an Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands, that there are Palestinians in Jordan, but they did not really go through a major war or crisis of this magnitude and this intensity. And very few of them have read history or have witnessed sort of the last 30, 40 years, particularly since the beginning of Oslo, right? So we haven't seen anything like this. So for a lot of this young generation, there is sort of this new sense of anger at not only Israel, but primarily the United States, and they see the United States as complicit in the killing of so many Palestinian civilians, right? That's sort of the framing of how they see it. But they're learning a lot about all of this from social media. And of course, there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation across the board on both sides. And I know some friends in our foreign policy sector in the region, as well as in DC, who work on disinformation. And my conversations with them were very depressing, because they said they're like, they can't keep up with how much of that is there. But again, there's this personal component that when it comes to Jordan, especially, is very difficult to dispel, because people are trying to get in touch with family and friends. So they're getting firsthand information from those who are, in the West Bank, and less so, of course, from Gaza. And unfortunately, a lot of these images are, all across social media, images of, maimed children, destroyed buildings, and that's what's really fueling a lot of the anger. But also, I would say, like, despair and trauma. And unfortunately, there is a huge disconnect between how this trauma is impacting them versus how October 7th also impacted Israeli society. And how it holds its own traumatic sort of experience. So as close as they are geographically, as far as probably further apart they are sort of mentally and empathetically. And I'll stop right there, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. From an American point of view, it's all very upsetting and disturbing, obviously. And while maybe the king has been subdued, the Queen Rania has been quite controversial in some of her statements. And again, you see these protests, and I understand the sympathy for Palestinians, but just the pro-Hamas sentiment is very hard to understand. I was reading about when the protests in Jordan really ramped up again in March. A lot of people were pointing to a report in Al Jazeera. They had a conversation with a woman claimed to be from Gaza, reporting on an Israeli action in Al-Shifa hospital. and making all kinds of outrageous claims about rapes and systematic abuses and killings and murderings that were happening in Al-Shifa. And that became a real spark plug for people going back en masse to the streets in Jordan. And later turned out that Al Jazeera had to recognize that the story was largely untrue and probably fabricated. But that's the kind of information environment that you mentioned that we might be in part trying to battle against here, and that people are susceptible to. General Amidror, let me bring you into this to give an Israeli perspective on what you're seeing on the Eastern Front, how worried people are, and what if anything might be happening there, and that we could do about it.
I remember since I was very, very young, 65 years ago, that everyone in Israel spoke about the vulnerability of Jordan, and how, without help from the outside, British soldiers and American support, Jordan cannot survive. And the story is going on and on and on since the establishment of the state. And it's probably true. It's a very problematic state with very, very low economic capabilities, with the majority of Palestinians. Not everyone feels that it is his homeland, with the feeling which came from outside and became the rulers of this place. They don't have any roots in the area. And in very conservative society, in which all these issues of tribes and families are very important. In spite of all these issues, Jordan is surviving. It's not just that Jordan is surviving, its situation today is much better than in the past. From the Israeli point of view, we are sharing the longest border of Israel. And it is our clear interest to cooperate with Jordan. Otherwise, we might face problems along the border, which might bring to attrition war with the other side. I was in the Jordan Valley Brigade in the 70s, and I still remember before the Black September what was the situation along the border, from the Sea of Galilee to the to Aqaba. And from our point of view, Jordan is very important country for keeping the stability in the area, and for Israel it's kind of a buffer between all the problems of Iraq and so on, and the state of Israel. So the interest, the security, is very clear, the security interest here. And this is why we are investing so much, helping the regime to survive. It might be helicopters, it might be knowledge, it might be help in intelligence if there is a need. There is not such a big need because the intelligence apparatus of the Jordanians is in a very high level of capabilities. But all the military relations are a result of very well understanding inside Israel that there is no any way that Israel will give up the regime because it's very important for blocking any attempt from the east to come into the West Bank and Israel. Just tonight, we found smugglers with 76 guns. It's a huge number. And we know that it might happen in spite all the good relations with some cooperation in Jordan, because we have in mind the member of the parliament who tried to smuggle in a huge amount of weapons and munition. So we understand the sensitivity of the situation. We understand the need of the regime to be judged by the population as one who is not cooperating with Israel too much. But at the same time, I think that the Jordanians understand, the regime understand, that without this cooperation, I don't know if they can survive. Probably not. So in a way, they are playing between the two needs. One is to keep the relation between Israel and Jordan, because they understand that it is crucial for them, and they know that it is important for us. And at the same time, not to give the impression that they are too cooperative with Israel. And everything which can be done under the table is better to do under the table than on the table. There are issues that cannot be done under the table. If they want water from us, it will not be done under the table. And we are now subsidizing the price that they are paying for huge amount of water that Israel provide Jordan. The same is about gas, that they pretend to buy from American company, but the American company is the one which is drilling near the seashore of Israel. So it is kind of relations that at the same time, it's very important, and you do whatever you can to keep the relations or even enhance it in some areas. But at the same time, parallel to that, you have to show that you are not too cooperative. I think that the weakest point, there are two weak points in Jordan. One is the demography issue. At the end of the day, you cannot ignore it. I don't know if it is 60%, 70%, 75%. No one knows exactly. And there are many of intermarriage between Palestinians and Jordanians, as the Jordanians used to say. Jordanian means that you are not Palestinian. They still keep some areas without Palestinians. In the army, it's very rare to find an officer with Palestinian origin. A few years ago, there was not even one. I don't know today. And they know that the intelligence and so on and so forth should be Jordanian. So the whole demography issue is a problem. And the second one is economy. The economic situation is very fragile, and Israel, my recommendation, everyone that I meet and ask what can be done to enhance the stabilization in the Middle East is to support the Jordanian economy. I think it's very crucial. We try to help, but it's not enough. The other Arab countries and the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, are supportive of it. Then again, the system in Jordan is not strong enough, and they didn't succeed to make the jump into the 23rd century, and it still very much depends on money coming from the outside. It's bad, but this is the situation. I think that as Egypt, in Jordan, there is a huge gap between the attitude of the regime towards Israel. It's well understood there that it is crucial for their survival, and the attitude of the people in the street. And you can see it from time to time. By the way, it's not the only country in the Middle East. This is written. Egypt is a good example for such a situation. Huge difference between the attitude of the huge gap between the attitude of the authorities and the attitude in the street. But I think that this one issue we cannot help, we cannot solve, is the demographic issue. The second one, the economy, is something that we, America, Israel, and other countries should do whatever they can to help. It might be with gestures, it might be with helping the export to run into the Mediterranean and so on and so forth. And in many cases, it's just money.
Okay. Good, thank you. Gaith, let me go back to you just to begin drilling down on some of these challenges. The question of Islamism in Jordan, there's obviously a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated party that holds seats in the Jordanian parliament, never too many. But But obviously, in the wake of Gaza, there are questions about what's happening within the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. Is it radicalizing? What are the links to Hamas? And what role, if any, given Iran's current status as the primary patron of Hamas, are there emerging links and support from the IRGC to elements, Islamist elements, Muslim Brotherhood elements in Jordan? What are we seeing? What's the landscape?
Thank you very much. Before I get to this, I want to kind of highlight one point, one theme that Yaakov mentioned, which is the Jordan-Israel piece. And I think it's very important to highlight that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think one of the concerns I see in Jordan is that they feel that, at least in the political echelon in Israel, they feel it's kind of Jordan gets everything and almost taken for granted. But I think what Yaakov mentioned really reflects the view in the Israeli security and military establishment. Now, to your question, Jordan, I want to go back in history a bit. Jordan's approach dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood and with Islamists since really the 1940s has been try to contain them. There was some sort of unwritten understanding between Jordan and the Muslim Brotherhood that the regime will allow the Muslim Brotherhood to work in the kind of charity, educational, religious space, but stay away from the security and foreign policy space. And that kind of largely held for a long time. This started changing in the 1990s after the peace treaty. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and Hamas started developing very strong relationships. And the traditional kind of, pact between the Muslim Brotherhood and the regime came under stress. We saw this very clearly in the 1990s, so much so that in 1999, I believe, Jordan ended up expelling some of the Hamas leaders who were in Jordan, including the Hamas leader at that time, Khalid Mish'al, and some others. And since then, there's been really an intensive attempt to create a firewall between the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood and the Hamas, as well as a parallel effort to weaken the Muslim Brotherhood, not in the kind of typical, let's say, Egyptian or whatnot way of bloody crackdowns, but through engineering splits and splinters and using legal means, etc. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think Marissa mentioned it with the regime, the relationship has been up and down. When the Muslim Brotherhood feels that they have a chance to kind of basically capitalize on public anger, they try to do it. We saw it in the Arab Spring, and we're seeing it happening right now. I don't think that there are, if you wish, kind of, clear organizational links between the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. But there's definitely fellow travelers and symbiotic relationships. The Hamas spokesman, Abu Ubaidah, in every second statement he makes, he calls on Jordanians to take to the streets. Khalid Mish'al and others have done the same. And the Muslim Brotherhood, in turn, has really also tried to amplify this and capitalize it and use this, the tensions that Marissa mentioned, and they are very deeply felt feelings among Jordans of kind of sympathy with the Palestinians. They try to use it for their own interest, and we see the Muslim Brotherhood moving to a much more hardline position than they were, say, 9-10 months ago. We'll see. There's an election happening in a few months, and we'll see if this translates into elections. Now, to your point about the Iranians, the Iranian-Muslim Brotherhood relation is always complex. It's always complex because at the end of the day, you have one Arab Sunni group, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, and you have a Shia Persian group, and that is the Iranian regime. And so the amount of overt cooperation will always be constrained. We saw this, for example, when the Muslim Brotherhood were in charge in Egypt, where there was a very kind of strange dynamics. But in this particular case, I think there is a meeting of minds, if not complete understanding. Certainly, the messaging that we see from Muslim Brotherhood, both in Jordan and elsewhere, Jazeera, etc., and the Iranian messaging tend to converge. And recently, there was actually a case where the Jordanian intelligence, which, as Yaakov said, is an extremely professional apparatus, actually found members of the Muslim Brotherhood, junior members, who basically had weapons and were planning to do some terror attacks. What's interesting in that particular incident is that I do believe that the Muslim Brotherhood's saying that these are individual members doing it on their own. And if it were more than this, the Jordanian intelligence would have cracked down very heavily on the MB. So these were individual cases, but it tells you that this kind of joint messaging makes it easier for the Iranians to infiltrate and to recruit people who are within the Muslim Brotherhood space. This is as well coupled with adding external pressure that will divert some of the security and intelligence resources, whether in the north with the smuggling, whether in the east with mobilizing some of the Iraqi pro-Iranian militias. But with the MB and Iran, and back to your question, I see an intersection of interest, but I just don't see a strategic cooperation. But they don't need to strategically cooperate because this is such a fragile moment that this intersection of interest is certainly creating a very serious threat, I would say, to Jordan's, I wouldn't say overall stability, but certainly in terms of their counter-terror efforts.
Marissa, can you just expand on that? Because just on how do you think the Iranians are now thinking about Jordan? We see a number of these specific dots. We see, what looks like significant drug smuggling activity, particularly out of Syria, sponsored by the Iranian-backed regime in Syria. Hezbollah clearly involved in the drug trade. Jordan engaged in armed clashes with drug smugglers and even unprecedentedly conducting airstrikes inside of Syria against alleged drug smuggling centers in southern Syria. Then we obviously have all of this arms smuggling activity, some of it, just recently discovered, including in military airports that are used by U.S. forces in Jordan, where they found an arms cache, lots of explosives, RPGs, other kinds of weaponry. A lot of it looks like it's headed to the West Bank. Some of it has no doubt made it into the West Bank, but are other parts of it intended for use by people in Jordan? We've had Iraqi militias threatening to kind of mobilize thousands of people inside of Jordan in their own militias, kind of extending the Iranian-backed proxy strategy into Jordan. Can you untangle some of this and what are the Iranians up to and how serious is it all when you put it all together?
I think the Iranians know very well all of these different vulnerabilities that you've pointed to. The domestic components that Ghaith talked about, Yaakov highlighted the economic situation, and I will go back and emphasize that once again with just random figures that will be quite alarming. So youth unemployment in Jordan today is around 40%. 40. This is the highest that it's been. You have young people who are educated, unable to find job opportunities. The market is small, and the government remains to be the largest employer at the time and unable to sort of employ more people with this ceiling that they've set, and that adds to it. Sort of course, it's not the only driver, but I think that creates a conducive environment for these vulnerabilities to be taken advantage by a country like Iran, which basically, looking at the map, sees Jordan as sort of the only buffer. So if that falls, if that domino falls, let's say, then they have direct access. And yes, you were absolutely right. The drug trade did intensify actually post October 7th. This is one of the reasons why, even though there was some hesitancy by the Jordanian government when Arab states decided to normalize, to actually go in that direction, but they did anyway. A lot of this was also led by the Emiratis and the Saudis. But one of the items on the agenda with the
normalized with Syria.
With Syria, correct.
Yeah.
But one of the items on the agenda, one of the top items was, well, let's talk about this drug trade. Why are you, using Jordan not only as transit, but this is, the security forces, that I've heard from are concerned about not just only the transit component, but also consumption. So all of these different challenges, sort of are compounded. And so, yes, this has surged since October 7th, and we've seen, images of also the pro-Iranian militia. And, in your introductory remarks, John, you mentioned April 13th, and Jordan's role at the time. There were statements coming out of Tehran basically threatening that any country that helps Israel in this attack will also be attacked. And Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi, just a day or two later than some of the Iranian ambassador, and I think some of these statements were retracted. But I think it does reflect the Iranian thinking about Jordan. And there's never been any love lost. I think Jordan has always pursued a very pragmatic foreign policy. It's understood the threat to its own population. I think one of the sort of saving graces is that sort of the Sunni Shia divide that Ghaith talked about, and more in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think when it comes to the population itself, you don't see this evangelizing happening in Jordan like we've seen it, for example, in Syria, which was very, very active, from Sunni to Shia Islam, that is. But when you have I don't say this to basically equate every young person in Jordan or in the Middle East to a potential extremist or violent extremist, but the economic situation is dire, and that a lot of resources have to be put in place to sort of push reform agendas, create job opportunities, because that makes it very easy for exploitation. And the security forces, as we've heard from Ghaith and Yaakov, their hearts and minds are in the right place when it comes to defending the western border, and ensuring that it is intact. But if you have smuggling taking place, it's because there are other components that are being probably taken advantage. And so this is why this is one of the main reasons why I think you've seen a more sort of balanced approach by the king himself when it comes to all the different components of all the different angles and the different threats. One thing also to sort of to add here is that I don't think that there is clear messaging from the Jordanian government about the extent of the Iranian threat. I think this used to be sort of messaging during the Iraq War that was a little bit more real. And I think, when you talk to people, they don't necessarily see Iran as a threat to the region or to Jordan's stability. But there is some hesitation to sort of go all out also in the government's messaging against Iran, because once again, the government and the regime is constantly trying to balance all the different threats that they have to grapple with in the most delicate way.
Yeah, I would just say on that point, on April 13th, I mean, it was, whatever complaints people have about statements by Queen Rania or efforts by the Jordanian government to somehow balance, to achieve the kind of balance that General Amidor spoke about, the Jordanians stepping up on April 13th and actually publicly declaring that, yes, they were part of this operation, that nobody was going to be sending hostile projectiles over Jordanian territory without the Jordanian government doing something to defend its sovereignty, I think was an incredibly important moment. But it's also, as far as I can tell, at least in the social media space, the government came under dramatic criticism for that, with even, pictures of King Abdullah in an Israeli flag or an IDF uniform appearing all over social media. So they came under withering criticism from their own population and very little support for doing the courageous thing they did on on the night of April 13th and 14th. General Amidwar, let me bring you in on what you think the Iranians are up to. What is the game plan? Do they really believe they can bring Jordan into their ring of fire that they have developed around Israel, or are they just looking at it right now as a transit point to get to the West Bank?
John, I think before that, I want to mention that when we are quoting from the social media, in this case, we cannot know what was originated in Jordan and what was originated in Iran. And no question that the Iranians use this opportunity to put the blame on the king and the regime, because they understood that there are enough Jordanians, which maybe are not so against the regime, that they are very against Israel. And that might bring them, because we know from the past experience that the Iranians are using their attitude towards Israel to legitimize their situation within the Arab world. So I don't know how much of that you just quoted was originated in Iran and how much was originated in Jordan. Probably there are other members of this meeting can be more accurate than me about it. And just have the question, I don't have an answer. About Iran, we know for sure the Iranians are putting huge effort towards two areas now. One is the West Bank, and the other one is Jordan. Jordan, as I explained, when you look at the map, you understand this is the buffer state between Israel and the East. If they succeed to topple the regime or make it less cooperated with Israel or whatever, weakening it, that will be a huge achievement for Iran. When you look at the Ring of Fire, when I wrote first time about the Ring of Fire, I didn't want to mention Jordan because I understood that this is not part of it, and what the Iranians want to do is to make it part of it. That will be maybe the biggest achievement of the Iranians since the establishment of Hezbollah, or the success to build Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it is very much connected to the West Bank, because they understand that if they access in Jordan, it will be much easier to infiltrate to the West Bank. And as I said, this efforts of the Iranians to bring more weapons and a huge of money to support the supporters of Iran in the West Bank is something that we see. We have evidence that more money is coming from Iran and more efforts to infiltrate into Israel and to smuggle in weapons. These are the efforts that they are doing, and Jordan is a crucial part of this plan of the Iranians. Strategically, this is probably against Israel is probably the most important issue. And remember, if they achieve Jordan, they have direct access to Saudi Arabia at the same time. So I think that from their point of view, it's not only Israel. Israel is maybe the priority number one, but it's not only Israel. It's the backyard of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, very important. I know in the Prime Minister's remarks to the JINSA delegation last week, he not only mentioned Iranian having Jordan in their sights, but also Saudi Arabia was mentioned. We're running out of time. I want to do one more round in which to let people mention anything they think we haven't mentioned, but also to just touch on what do we do about this? Understanding that the Gaza war hopefully is moving to a different, less intensive combat phase, but that Hezbollah and a possible northern war looms on the horizon. Days don't look like they're getting any easier. What do we do to help shore up things in Jordan and shore up these crucial relationships between Jordan and the United States, Jordan, Israel, Jordan, and the pragmatic Sunni Arab states. Gaith, let's start with you.
All right, look, again, a couple of quick reactions and what do we do? Quick reactions is I think, look, I wasn't surprised when April happened because those of us who've been following Jordan know that for all of the political ups and downs, there are certain relationships that the Jordanians do not play with when it comes to security and military, whether the US, whether Israel, some of us. So I was not surprised. And I hope that we gave the audience kind of, a whiff of what this relationship is. There is a lot that we cannot and should not talk about in terms of how deep it is, but it is very real and saw it in display in April. Now, what do we do about it? I think, again, there are two different sets here. One is the US, one in Israel. And I would say in both, though, let's try to keep the relationship depoliticized. I mean, Yaakov mentioned the issue of water. For Israel to agree to this addition of water, it was a political saga, and there was a lot of, let's say, unpleasant things done. If you want to support your ally, you don't kind of drag them through the mud as we saw in that particular case. So I think sometimes it's healthy, and I think it's worth on both sides, of course, to take a step back and remember that this is a strategic relationship that should not be subject to this kind of political drama that we often see. I would say the same with the US relations, particularly if we have a Trump 2 administration. I think it's very important, particularly for if we have, depending on who we have in the foreign policy team, for these people to be very aware of the importance for Jordan for not only Israeli interest, but also American interest. I felt with some of the folks in the previous Trump administration, it took them a while to catch up on this, but I think knowing how important this and what not only the Jordanians benefit from it, but what also their partners, whether in the US or in Israel, benefit from it, is key to maintaining this. Because as Yaakov said, if anything happens in Jordan, it's bad for everyone involved. Bad for the Israelis, bad for the Saudis, and certainly we in this country will lose a very important partner and a very steady partner that we have in that region.
Yeah, great. I would just, remind the audience that I think the U.S. currently gives about $1.5 billion a year of support to Jordan. We have several thousand of our forces at different times deployed in different parts of Jordan. Marissa, any closing thoughts from you, and particularly what can be done tactically to kind of support the Jordanians as they deal with these competing issues and challenges?
I think, first of all, thank you for hosting this discussion. I think sometimes it's uncomfortable to hear, how things are playing out in Jordan and amongst Jordanians, but I think it's important to talk about it because it helps explain why we're hearing such strong, and aggressive statements from the government, in particular. So there is always context, and context is important. I would go back and, in addition to what Raif mentioned on both sides with regards to the Israeli relationship with Jordan, but also the US, is to ensure that there's more emphasis on economic reforms, that there's more seriousness moving forward. There's always low-hanging fruit as to what the government can do without sort of shaking, that social contract that has been set in place for so long. But things have to be done a little bit differently, and I think that that's one arena where the US can be very, very helpful. But the economy is key. And again, I think, we talked about public sentiment a little bit earlier. Things will start to wind down as the war winds down. Of course, there will still be a lot of this anger and pain, but I think that we have to continue to talk about a two-state solution of some sort, which is why the Jordanians keep talking about it when they see the US more serious about pursuing that path. Then there's also that helps Jordan and basically protects its national interests.
Okay, thank you, Marissa. General Amador, let me go to you on things that might be done to help the Jordanians. Nobody's mentioned, I mean, they're obviously facing this terrible difficulty. They have these militias in Iraq, these smuggling operations out of Syria, some degree of porousness in the West Bank border. Isn't there more that can be done to bolster the border control of Jordan, more intelligence, cooperation that needs to happen? What can we do to try and dampen this serious problem?
I must confess that it's not the military security relations which I'm worried about. That we are doing very well between the two countries. We have strong relations with protocols, what we can do together and how we are cooperating. And I think this is in a good position. The main problem in which we might have to do more, and of course with that we need the cooperation of the Jordanians, is in the economic side. And I know the problems of the Jordanians to agree to big projects with Israel because they don't want to see too many words like Israel in many places. And if you do something big with the Israelis will be there and Israel will be there. So here is the limbo that we are in. In one side, it's clear that Israel can help this big project with financed by the United States of America or other Arab countries. There are at least two big projects that I know about that because the Jordanians do not feel comfortable with Israeli involvement now because of the war, they stop the project, and the result will be less productivity for their economy. So I think that this is the area in which, together with the Jordanians and the Americans, we have to find ways to cooperate because the potential is very, very high.
Okay, terrific. We'll have to bring it to a close there. I want to thank all of our panelists. As Marissa said, these are sometimes difficult issues to actually try and understand what's happening in another country, even when we deeply disagree with some of what we see and we worry. Is it counterproductive? Is it only feeding the problem and creating this cycle? But obviously, the leaders in Jordan have, as Gaith said at the beginning, have a long track record of being able to manage and understand how to balance their internal political affairs in a successful way. We've had dark moments like Black September in 1970, where an awful lot of Palestinians were killed by the Jordanian military. We had the incidents around the first Gulf War, where Jordan chose incorrectly and potentially disastrously, but within a few years, we had a Jordan-Israel peace treaty coming out of all of that. So hopefully, everybody will make the correct decisions and be able to figure out a way for us all to move forward together here in a very productive way and more hopeful way than the current spot we're in. But thank you to all of you. Appreciate it. Appreciate the audience, and please join us for our next GINSA webinar. And a happy 4th of July to everybody who's celebrating here in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you very much, and happy 4th of July.
Thank you, General.